Loyalists who fled to Canada or British North America around the time of the American Revolution uniquely shaped Canada's demographics and culture in ways that can still be seen today. These Loyalists are sometimes referred to as United Empire Loyalists, or Tories in the United States. They consisted of American colonists of different ethnicities who supported Britain, as well as indigenous groups like the Haudenosaunee who helped the British fight the Americans. After the 7 Years' War, the French ceded their colonies in North America to Britain, making Britain a dominant power in the world. In a bit over a decade, Britain was at war once again, but this time against the 13 colonies in North America. In the 13 colonies, opinions were divided in regards to whether American independence or loyalty to Britain should be supported. Britain had increased the taxes in the 13 colonies to pay for the 7 Years' War, passed several acts that were considered by some to be intolerable, had an obvious military power in the colonies, and just generally increased their power and control in the colonies while not comprehending the experiences of the American colonists. This angered many of the colonists, and as British military presence escalated with protests, more and more American colonists wanted to separate from Britain, leading to the American Revolutionary War. However, not all colonists wanted a revolution, and some openly opposed the idea. While the Loyalists may not have been pleased with Britain's course of action, they did not want the outbreak of war and believed that the tense situation could be resolved without fighting on a battlefield. Loyalists had various reasons for supporting Britain. Some were simply nationalistic and true to Britain, the mother country of most colonists, while others did not think that involvement in a war would be beneficial and held political opinions contrary to those of the American patriots. Furthermore, some American colonists treated groups of religious, linguistic, or ethnic minorities with contempt, leading some groups to flee to Canada for protection. It is unclear what percent of the American population were Loyalists and what percent were patriots. Estimates range from 10% to 20%, and it is important to note that not everyone was wholly decided upon who they wanted to support. There were American colonists who chose to neither support nor oppose the American Revolution, and just continued to live in the same place once the United States formed. However, the general number used to estimate the number of Loyalists is 125,000. At this time, there were about 2,500,000 people in the 13 colonies, excluding indigenous peoples. According to historian Maya Jasanoff, approximately 60,000 people emigrated from America at the time of the American Revolution. Nevertheless, there were likely more who, although loyal to Britain, decided not to emigrate. Showing loyalty to Britain before and during the American Revolution was dangerous for Loyalists, and differing political opinions tore some families apart. Loyalists could lose their civil rights, experience mob violence or humiliation, get thrown in prison, and have their property vandalized. This treatment convinced many Loyalists to immigrate to Canada and was one of the main push factors. Loyalists were also given free land, which was another attraction Canada offered. Now, not all Loyalists fled to Canada, but for many, Canada was the closest and safest option. The Loyalists were not one specific group or class of individuals, but came from all walks of life and statuses. Some were trained professionals like doctors or clergy, others were escaped enslaved people, indigenous peoples, or recent immigrants to the 13 colonies. They had different skills and levels of education, so when the Loyalists fled to Canada, it was a diverse group of people who arrived and changed the demographics in British North America. At the time of the American War for Independence, some of the colonies to the north of the 13 colonies were also unsure about whether they should keep their allegiance to England or join the Americans. In Nova Scotia, there was an interest in joining the Revolution, but not so great that there was ever a major protest. Halifax was a military base, where people were paid by the English government, making them generally in support of Britain, and merchants also benefited from a positive relationship with England. Mather Byles, a reverend in Halifax, considered in regards to the American War for Independence, which is better, to be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away, or by 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? Newfoundland was in a similar situation, with much of the population, although not perfectly pleased with Britain, satisfied with their treatment. Quebec was mostly French at the time, and Guy Carleton was the governor. People did not particularly like him, but most also did not like the Americans. Jean Oliver Briand, the Bishop of Quebec, even supported Carleton, and stated, "The singular kindness and gentleness with which we have been governed on the part of His Gracious Majesty King George III, the recent favors which he has bestowed upon us in permitting us the usage of our laws, the free exercise of our religion, and allowing us to participate in all the privileges and advantages of British subjects, are sufficient without doubt to arouse your zeal to support the Crown of Great Britain." Loyalists left for Canada before, during, and after the American War for Independence. The journey was often difficult, and many families or individuals left their homes without much time to prepare. There were different routes people took to Canada when on foot or traveling upriver, but they would often go through indigenous lands, and sometimes indigenous groups would help guide them on their journey. Flooding rivers, insects, and bad weather could greatly slow the journey. Not only were there natural forces to contend with, but there was the danger that American patrols would capture the refugees. Sometimes Loyalists could make the journey to Quebec in 13 days, but it could take up to 3 months if boat connections could not be acquired, the weather was bad, and the people traveling were not physically capable of moving quickly. Loyalists also fled by traveling over the Atlantic to Nova Scotia. With the Treaty of Paris ending the American War for Independence in 1783, Loyalists, the British Army, and freed enslaved people evacuated New York. It took 3 months for the city to be completely evacuated. In this time, 20,000 soldiers and approximately 35,000 Loyalists were evacuated. This painting, made by Henry Sandham about a century after the Loyalists fled to Canada, is called The Coming of Loyalists, and depicts a romanticized version of the Loyalist arrival in modern-day New Brunswick. Even in Canada, conditions for the Loyalists were not easy. One woman writes, "We pitched our tents in the shelter of the woods and tried to cover them with spruce boughs. We used stones for fireplaces. Our tents had no floors but the ground. How we lived through that winter, I barely know." And another woman records from St. John, New Brunswick, "I climbed to the top of Chipman's Hill and watched the sails in the distance, and such a feeling of loneliness came over me that though I had not shed a tear through all the war, I sat down on the damp moss with my baby on my lap and cried bitterly." Areas were overcrowded, but individuals still felt alone as they were far away from the land they were accustomed to. The British provided for Loyalist refugees in some ways, but since the evacuation was so hasty, little had been prepared ahead of time, making life for the Loyalists difficult. England offered 100 acres of land for the head of each household, giving the Loyalists an opportunity to start their new life in Canada. However, Loyalists who had arrived before or at the beginning of the Revolution were able to procure more land, and the later Loyalists were looked down upon. Since so many Loyalists landed in the St. John Valley, Nova Scotia was divided and New Brunswick was formed in 1784. This colony was made up almost entirely of Loyalists. Cape Breton Island, another area many Loyalists had landed, also became its own colony, but was later merged with Nova Scotia again. Although the Maritime provinces received the greatest population increase from Loyalists, approximately 2,000 moved to Lower Canada, or what is now Quebec. Many of these had not come by ship, but rather on foot and up the rivers. The governor of Quebec issued these Loyalist supplies, and many of the men joined the British regiments. Another 7,500 came to live in Upper Canada, or Ontario. In 1791, Upper Canada became its own province, largely due to the Loyalists who moved there. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy had played an influential role in supporting Britain during the American Revolution, and Chief Joseph Brant, or Tyenadaga, a very prominent figure, led his community out of New York State and into Canada. These indigenous Loyalists received a land grant on the Grand River. In this area is the town of Brantford, named after Chief Joseph Brant. While the conditions white Loyalists experienced were challenging, black Loyalists experienced far worse treatment. In an effort to recruit soldiers in 1775, a British governor issued a proclamation that any enslaved or indentured person would be freed if they joined the British and helped fight the Americans. Many black Loyalists joined the British, as well as black enslaved people with their white masters. When the war ended, many black Loyalists moved to Nova Scotia. Despite their efforts in the war, the black Loyalists were the last to receive land grants. In 1787, black Loyalists received land grants in Birchtown, but their lots were smaller than those the white Loyalists received. Challenges this group of Loyalists faced included starvation, cheap labor, harsh winters, lack of educational opportunities, and shortages of clothing. Black Loyalists often had to build their own schools and churches without support. These communities also experienced racism, and in 1784 there was a 10-day riot in which white Loyalists destroyed the property of black Loyalists. Conditions were so bad that in 1792 about 1,200 black Loyalists left Nova Scotia for Sierra Leone, Africa. This picture, made in 1788, shows a Nova Scotian Loyalist in Shelburne. The Loyalists who fled to Canada during the American Revolution faced many hardships, including starvation, overcrowding, and harsh weather. But through these challenges, the Loyalists helped to make Canada into the nation it is today. Both Ontario, or Upper Canada as it was at the time, and New Brunswick were formed due to the population increase when the Loyalists came to Canada. Canada's preference to avoid revolutions can be seen in the Loyalists, and multiculturalism in Canada grew through the people of many ethnicities, cultures, and statuses who came to Canada during the American War for Independence.